This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 375, Being a Creative Director. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about being a creative director with Randy Ost. Randy's goal as a creative director is to make the online world as approachable, understandable, and delightful as the real world. As the product lead for Emulsify, Randy is creating a design token-based theme for designers and developers to better work together by using shared tools. Randy, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-host is John Picozzi, solution architect at EPAM.
Hello, internet friends. If you happen to be watching the video, you may notice I am wearing a New England Drupal Camp shirt with a brand new logo on it. This past weekend, I was in Providence, Rhode Island, helping to run the New England Drupal Camp, and we had a great time. Friday was a training day. Saturday was a session day. Session videos are up online if you're interested. We'll put a link in the show notes to that. Highlights, I recommend the keynote by our friend Kaleem Clarkson. And Nick is partial to the web component videos. So there were 2 or 3 sessions about web components. So I recommend checking those out.
Absolutely. Good to see everybody. In news this week, Drupal 10 RC1 was released. So if you're looking forward to Drupal 10, check that out. I've been tinkering with it a bit and working on upgrading some modules to Drupal 10, or at least providing merge requests for that. So yeah, definitely keep tabs on that. We're getting pretty close to release.
Hey, I have a question on merge requests. Are you using you're using the new merge request workflow, or are you still like producing patches?
Actually, usually both. I usually do the merge request because it's easier for the maintainer to like merge that in and get it into a release. But the patch is easier for including in a project. Like if it's a longer running patch, it's going to take some, that you need to use for a project. It's just easier to specify that, because if you specify the diff from the merge request, anytime somebody makes a change to that, your build will change. So I always create a static patch.
All right, there you go.
And now we're going to talk about the module of the week. So let's bring in Martin Anderson-Klutz, Senior Solutions Engineer at Acquia, maintainer of a large number of Drupal modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
So this week, we're going to be talking about a module called Event Condition Action, also known as ECA, which provides a powerful, versatile, and user-friendly rules engine. It was created in July of 2021 and currently has 2 versions available, a 1.06 release and a 1.10 Alpha 2 release. Both support Drupal 9 and 10. And both were released November 18th, so quite recently. And I think that's one thing anybody who's interested will find about ECA is that it's very actively maintained. There's actually a team of developers who all seem to be quite involved, have biweekly meetings in Slack. Currently only used by 302 sites, but as I say, it seems like the issue queue moves pretty fast on that module. The team of maintainers is led by Jürgen Haas, who's a longtime Drupal contributor and himself a maintainer of quite a variety of modules. I think for anybody who has used, let's say, the rule module, either in Drupal 9 or in earlier versions of Drupal, one of the big things that sets ECA apart is its use of business process modeling notation, or BPMN. You can either use that sort of built directly into the website as sort of a visual workflow editor, or you can also use like desktop software. There's a application called Camunda that they mention on the actual ECA project page. So a variety of different ways to sort of integrate that with, I would say, very robust, kind of business workflow software. So really allows a site to develop a very complex set of rules, but in a way that, because it's visually built, can be easier to work with sort of other business stakeholders. And the other thing that I think is really interesting about ECA is there's also a pretty rich ecosystem of modules in terms of integrations with a variety of other sort of Drupal contrib modules. So maybe to kind of open this up to the group, let's talk a little bit about cases where you've needed to implement complex rules in Drupal, and maybe in particular cases where that kind of a visual approach to building out the rules would have been helpful.
Can I ask a question before we dive into that question? And this might be like an old time Drupal-y question, so I apologize. Is this like a rules replacement, like a rules module replacement, or is it in addition to? Like, how does this kind of fit in?
I would say it's an alternative to. So the rules module is available for Drupal 9. I'm not sure if it's ready for 10 yet, but I think last time I checked, it was still in an alpha state. And so ECA was really developed, I think, to provide a rich set of rules that's a little bit more stable, and then also has this sort of BPMN notation feature to add a new layer of capability there.
I have to say I'm really excited about this module. Not so much because I would use it on every single site, right? Now that I'm a much more proficient coder or developer, I probably would do a lot of the stuff that you can do with a module like this in a custom module, right? But I think there's two huge advantages. One is I think that the rules module, especially in Drupal 7 and before, was a critical part of the Drupal training pipeline of like up-leveling kind of junior developers or site builders into more of the developer space, because rules gave you a way to really like, how do you think about a problem? How do you think about, if this, then that? And how do you think through what that workflow looks like, but gives them a kind of point and click interface. It also gives the websites kind of the ability to, on the other side, it gives the websites the ability to grow. So another thing that Drupal 7 did great is if you were a really small business just starting out, you didn't have a huge budget, you could hire a site builder and get a lot of this stuff into rules. And then as the business grows, maybe a lot of those rules gets replaced with a custom module once you get bigger. But there's a big base of simpler Drupal sites that get this that can grow organically from very simple to very complex. And without that kind of point and click adventure portion of it, it's hard to have both the site builder, the complex site builder role, as well as have the simpler site with slightly more complex functionality. So like I said, there might not be, now that I am more familiar with coding, I might not use this on every project. It might be useful for those types of rules, kind of like web form, where you want you have an end user with a slightly technical person. You want them to be able to tweak things, maybe change thresholds or things like that. It might be great for that situation too, because then you don't have to build out that whole interface. You don't have to build out all the configuration for it. So I'm really excited to start looking at this again. I think it's really been one of those things that the Drupal community, it really stood out. Rules really stood out in the Drupal community and has been missing for a long time.
I can say that rules really helped me a lot. I do a lot of development work for tabletop role-playing games, and I built a website called Bits and Mortar, where like if you buy the physical book, the store that sold it to you can send you the PDF. And I used rules a lot to do download counts, to provide to publishers, to lock down downloads. Like after 5 downloads, they were done. I'm not the engineer that everybody else on the call is, and so I was able to put my logic in a point and click adventure sort of way, like you said, Nick. And so this particular module, giving that capability to Drupal 9 and Drupal 10 is going to be awesome. I'm probably going to explore it too, because Bits and Mortar is getting a little bit long in the tooth and could use an update.
Yeah, I think I would echo some of the other comments here and just say that, I haven't personally had a chance to play around with this a lot, but I'm excited for the opportunity when I eventually have the right project.
Thank you, Martin. I would like to mention too that this is probably the most requested module of the week. I think it was requested even before you started taking over the correspondence piece of this, but it's been requested a few times since you started. So on that note, if somebody does have a suggestion, feel free to ping us in the Talking Drupal channel of the Drupal Slack, and Martin will take a look and get it on the schedule, I think. So thank you, Martin, and on to our primary topic. Okay, so we all think that we know in the back of our mind maybe what a creative director is, but can you give us a description, Randy, of what is a creative director? What does the day-to-day look like?
Sure. So creative director is one of those titles that the meaning changes based on the context. Like the creative director for a fashion company is different from a magazine company, from an advertising agency, for a website development shop. So there's a lot of different like context that goes into it. I'm going to speak from the point of view of a digital agency that creates websites and experiences. So, my job as a creative director is to make sure that I am overseeing the visual design, the user experience, the information architecture, and the content that goes into a site and how that is managed. So, everything that is like kind of comes before engineering is generally like what I'm overseeing and what my team is overseeing. So I'm working with clients to uncover problems, trying to, my team is doing these things and I'm helping my team. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to keep a big vision when it comes to projects. Sometimes when my team gets into the weeds with a client, like there are a lot of like concerns and thoughts that go into things. And it's my job to kind of push and pull a little bit to try and get a little bit more, get something a little bit special out of it. For instance, we just launched a site about a month ago for the Wu Tsai Institute at Yale University. And the main page of it has a wealth of animation that is like really awesome. It's wti.yale.edu. The menu is like the whole design of it was centered around circles and these colored circles. And so the menu has this pop out circle that's really awesome that I challenged the front end engineers to build, and they loved it and it turned out great. So like part of my job as a creative director is to try and like bring those experiences to life in a large way.
So not a creative director like Steven Spielberg.
Yes.
That's what I was thinking originally when we started this show.
I was just going to say, like, in a way, there are parallels with what Steven Spielberg does. Although I'm not saying that I'm a Steven Spielberg, but it is about making sure that there is a vision from start to finish and what gets done. Steven Spielberg works with film and works with actors and works with script writers and all of that to produce a movie. That's part of what I do as a creative director, is make sure that the team is executing a consistent vision and puts together something that at the end of the project is something that we can be proud of, something that will get results for the client, and just generally improves in some small or large way life on Earth.
So with that said, and that was a great way to say that, how is a creative director at a technical company, which, I would say Four Kitchens is a tech company, right? Different from those other types of creative directors you kind of brought up earlier.
Sure. So being a creative director at an engineering heavy agency has particular challenges. Like in the last 10 years, Four Kitchens has been going from being engineering led to being more project results led. And that brings challenges because we want to maintain our engineering superiority, but we also want to bring about these and develop reputations in these other areas. And we've done an excellent job of bringing in user experience and bringing in visual design. The challenges are kind of using the materials that you have. Going back to that Steven Spielberg example that you mentioned, there are certain teams that he can use and there are certain teams that he can't use, maybe for budget reasons, maybe for planning reasons, like maybe somebody's booked. The same is true being at an agency like Four Kitchens. I have to work within the circumstances that I have. And so what I do as a creative director is I engage engage with the other teams at Fork Kitchen. So the back end engineers, the front end engineers, our technical strategy team, and the project managers. And I talk about what are the things that interest them, what are the things that they are pursuing, and what to do. And I try to lean into that. For instance, we have a front end engineer who right now is doing a lot of I think it's called D3, like real like JavaScript, like three-dimensional rendering, like does a lot of like complex stuff with Canvas. And I have told this engineer, I said, I want to 100% lean into that. And I said, do not be surprised, when I come to you and I ask you a lot of questions about what you can and cannot do, because I want to lean into the strengths of what people want to do. And I also want to lean away from things that are maybe like not possible to do. So, so those are some of the challenges there, and the ways that like they are addressed.
So one of the things that I'm curious about is, do you think that the underlying technology matters? Like, being a creative director, do you have to worry if something is in Drupal versus something else, or is your overall project guidance like the same? Like you're about the look, the feel, the experience, or does the technology really have any say in that?
Well, every decision within a project is going to impact the project. The reality is that if you choose Drupal, it's going to be different than if you chose WordPress, than if you chose Joomla, versus if you chose like Sanity. Okay, so like all of those different choices impact how things get done, what things are easier to do, what things are harder to do, and what possibilities exist. So, for instance, like being within the Drupal space, I know that the experience can be highly customized, which means that we can tailor an experience to exactly what it needs to be. I know that when we work on WordPress projects, we can also do that kind of tailoring, but we also have the ability to save costs by using pre-made plugins and making those recommendations and having us bend a little bit and use something that's off the shelf as opposed to custom, and then customizing in other places. And so like there are a wealth of these like trade-offs that happen as a result of the technology choice.
So just out of curiosity, how much like content modeling is your team doing, Randy, versus like,
Mhm.
An architect or more of the folks on the engineering side?
Sure. So that's basically my user experience strategists and the technical strategists generally get into fist fights, and whoever is the last person standing wins. Um, that's not true at all. The technical strategists and my user experience strategists work together during the discovery process and during our design process to come to a point where we have information architecture that then feeds into the wireframes that are done, and it's a collaborative process. So for some things that are maybe more technical in nature, we lean more on the technical strategist, and for things that like are more like user facing, maybe the user experience strategist is defining that, and they're working together to define what that content architecture looks like. We also on our team have a content strategist whose job it is to worry about content, and they contribute to that as well. Now that's a new position on my team, and it's growing very quickly. And we're still like figuring out exactly how that goes in. So it might be like a three-way fight in the future. But generally, like everybody collaborates together to make the best thing that we can.
So you're basically bringing in subject matter experts. So first, going back to Nick's original question, like how familiar do you have to be with the underlying technology? You're basically bringing in subject matter experts for those technologies to ensure that you're not creating something that's completely outside of the realm of possibility or making things more difficult, it sounds like.
Oh, absolutely. We involve a technical strategist from the start of a project and a technical lead from the start of a project. So the technical strategist is kind of like looking at the forest, and the tech lead is looking at the trees. And my team is like doing all of the creative work, and we're checking it against everybody to make sure that like, are we designing or building or planning something that's going to like blow the scope out of the water? Is it going to be difficult to do? And in fact, like, this is, we have a very good process for doing this, but recently there was a slideshow that we were putting together. We had these beautiful designs for it. It was very complicated. And I routed it through like 2 or 3 individuals, like people on the team and people outside of the team, because I wanted to make sure that it could be built. And I do some front end engineering myself, and I thought that it could be built. And then we passed the ticket off into the build phase. And we realized that it just couldn't be built. So we run across stuff like that sometimes where, we have to kind of back away and recover. But we do our due diligence to make sure that like we don't run into that problem very often. In fact, that's the only example that I have in the like 7 years that I've been at Four Kitchens where something was designed that we couldn't actually build.
So I just want to clarify something too. Like this is something that came up as I was reading these show notes and thinking specifically about being a creative director, and I'm curious about your perspective on this. You're a creative director. Generally, when somebody says somebody is a creative, it's like they're talking about visual creative, right? They're talking about visual designs or interactions. But when I was looking at this, I was thinking like, well, I'm still a creative. It's just my creative is more on the engineering side or the development side. So I wonder if there's like a language thing here that can be like, hey, visually creative or visually designed or something that can be used, because like I think it's interesting that creative is always pinned on like the visual, what you can see, and it isn't always thought about like what's going on behind the scenes, because there's people that can make the most performance site or the most cache site, like that's creative too. It's just maybe not immediately visible. And I'm curious if that's, if there's ever been any discussion internally about that.
Yeah, there's so I'm a big fan of using like appropriate language and appropriate words, for what the meaning is. And so 3 years ago, I got the opportunity to change my title.
Okay.
And so they're like, hey, what do you want the title to be? And what do you want the team name to be? And so I thought about it, and like, it's like, oh, it could be the design and UX team, but then like, what happens if I like broaden what I offer? I could call it design ops. But design ops just really sounds like real kind of businessy. And like, I didn't care for that. Plus the word design, it's like, well, design has a lot of visual connotations. And so like, I was just like creative. For me, the choice of the word creative was because I want to focus on a word that that wasn't part of the process. So like we have like design and UX and content strategy and information architecture as part of what my team does. And I didn't want to call us the like design ops when we did all of these other things. And I wanted a term that was going to be a little bit more inspirational. Like I want my team to be creative. I want them to come up with good solutions. And so that's why I chose the term creative for my team, which is the creative team, and went with creative director. To kind of circle back around to something that you said, Nick, I believe, like you do, that creativity isn't just like what people think of as art or visual like design. Yeah. Creativity exists in every endeavor that people do. The Legos that behind you are a creative endeavor. Whatever Absolutely. John's got in that closet behind him is a creative expression. So like, this is,
my Dries face right there. Is that what you're talking about?
Oh, yes. That's exactly what I'm talking to you about. And so like, we need to like use that. We all have creative energy. And if I could, I'd welcome everyone at Four Kitchens into the creative team, because we are all creative. But I needed to demarcate like my role and my team somehow. And that's kind of the reasoning behind my choice.
It's interesting because like, I think of like creative solutioning, right? Creative solutioning can come in a variety of different mediums, like Nick said, right? It could be design, it could be development. So I think like creative director is just a person who is guiding those creative solutions and those creative things. Let's go back to kind of the relationship between designers and developers, right? So like,
Sure.
that's probably a big part of the process, is kind of the handoff there. And you talked about it a little bit, right? With bringing in subject matter experts to make sure you guys are kind of staying true to what is possible. But sometimes things still get lost in translation, right? Between the design team and the development team. I'm wondering if you can give us any insights, tips or tricks into how you guys bridge that gap, and how you ensure like kind of that handoff is as without bumps as possible.
Sure. So it can be a rocky road between designers and developers. The way the tools that those two different groups use are dramatically different. The mental model that I kind of use is that designers are working in a medium where when they put something down on the page or the canvas, it stays. Okay. And developers are working within a medium that flows. And it flows, just from top to bottom, or from left to right if you decide to change the way that it goes. But they're working in two separate mediums that have two separate languages and two separate, like, kind of everything. And the trick is to make what tools that they're using speak more and more similar languages. And we're in an era right now where a lot of our tools are allowing us to speak the same language, or at least get close. So for instance, like, I remember doing design work in Photoshop and handing it off to an engineer. That engineer then had to use like color pickers and rulers to figure out like what sizing everything was. Now with tools like Figma and Zeppelin, developers can actually see what the values are and read that. And designers are getting tools to create like color palettes and consistent typography. And as long as they like use them, then that information goes to the developer. So like if my blue is like an aqua blue, then the front end engineer just needs to pull that, and anytime they see that color in a comp, they just apply that variable. And we're in a time right now where design tokens are taking off, which are design tokens are small little like design decisions. Like, this is the primary color, this is the secondary color, this is the primary font, this is the headline font. And these decisions can be communicated from design to front end. So like that's one of the things that I'm working on right now is being able to export from Figma directly into a code base and have it capture all of those design decisions, allowing front-end engineers to focus on the more challenging aspects and more interesting aspects of the work that they have to do.
So I have one aside here that I want to ask, because you are a creative director working with a creative team, probably using Figma, right?
Correct.
The Adobe acquisition, good thing, bad thing, or prefer not to say?
This is one of those areas where it's kind of like we have to wait and see what's going to happen. If we look at acquisitions that have happened in the past from Adobe, Adobe tends to like absorb and reinvent a lot of things. However, the person who led this acquisition for Adobe, I don't remember the specifics of like who did what, but the person who oversees like Creative Cloud and generally does acquisitions is not the person who led the Figma acquisition.
Oh, interesting.
It was a more business oriented person who led the acquisition of Figma. That to me is it's like, okay, so this is going to go differently than what other acquisitions have done. I also think that Figma has such success doing what they're doing right now that if Adobe tried to if Adobe like messed it up in any way, it's a fragile thing, because tools like Figma are getting easier and easier to make. In fact, there's an open source alternative, I think it's called PenPot, that is being worked on that I know when Adobe acquired Figma, a lot of people kind of started checking out PenPot. But I think that ultimately it's probably going to be a good thing. Um, my example that I tell people for acquisitions and my thoughts on Figma is like when Disney acquired Pixar. Okay, when Disney acquired Pixar, the leadership from Pixar basically took over Disney. And all of the prior to that acquisition, Disney was producing a lot of like direct to video, like Beauty and the Beast 3, like the Beastening. And as soon as Pixar was acquired, the new leadership was like, we're done with these dumb movies. We're only going to produce quality content. And Disney got better as a result of it. So I'm crossing my fingers that this Figma acquisition is going to be like the Pixar acquisition.
So an aside to my aside, and then I'll let Nick ask his actual question. If you have not yet, look into the origin story of Figma. It is very interesting and worth some time.
I will say too that Quant UX I think is another open source Figma alternative that I think has built-in heat maps and things that I've tinkered with a bit. So it might be worth looking into too if you're interested. So shifting gears a bit, I'm curious about how you mentor your team, and I'm curious about kind of two aspects of it. One is like individually, like individuals need mentoring on specific things, but you mentioned like changing, how the tide changes sometimes in the design world. Things are going more towards design tokens in your organization. How do you mentor your team kind of as a whole in keeping up with things and adopting this type of technology?
Sure. So, when you build a team, the very start of that process is hiring. And so like there's hiring, there's mentoring and maintaining, and then there's saying goodbye. Like there's an entire life cycle to a member of your team. And we have to acknowledge that entire life cycle. The start of it, when hiring, one of the questions that I always ask is, how do you stay current? Like, with what's going on. And I'll get responses like, listen to podcasts, I read Medium, I do this, I do that. And I ask that question because I just want to know that they are doing that sort of thing. Because that is a priority for me, is this idea of constantly improving. So, so whenever they become a team member, at Four Kitchens, we have hours that are not billable. So we have a billable expectation for everybody. And then outside that billable expectation, we give hours for people to attend internal meetings and also do professional development. I actively encourage professional development. If I find something interesting that I think someone likes, I say, hey, why don't you try out this or watch this video? Or like, for instance, the Clarity Design Systems Conference was just last week. I bought the video package and I, don't tell anyone, but I shared the link with my team so that they could watch the videos and we could have discussions around some of the topics. And so like, I try to encourage it that way. We also have quarterly goals that we try to achieve. Like people generally pick like one quarterly goal or two. And sometimes I encourage people, I'm like, hey, there's this new thing. Why don't you check out this new thing? And so it's, getting people to stay current is one of those things where like it's multi-pronged. You have to hire for it. You have to encourage and maintain it. And try to like build a culture around like staying current.
Interesting. So let's dig into that a little bit more from the interview perspective. I'm always interested to hear about kind of how other managers kind of interview folks. You just mentioned, obviously you ask people like how they stay current, right? Which is a pretty common question, I would imagine. Is there anything kind of outside of the box that you do when you're interviewing for creative position?
I don't know if there's anything that I would do that's like out of the box. But I think honestly, I think I've got a pretty sensible approach. And a lot of it has been inherited by our awesome like admin team at Four Kitchens. And what we do is we have a series of questions for a position for people to be able to demonstrate that they have knowledge in that role. So like we have like, here's a question, and then there's helper text for the co-interviewers that says, if they say these things, good. If they don't, then that's bad. If they give a generic, that way, some of the other people who maybe don't do as much hiring as I do as the creative director, they can give their input and understand what kind of input to give to that to make sure that those questions are being answered. And in addition to that, one of the things that I look for is I want to know a person's ability to like solve problems. Like one of the things that I look for in people is I don't want to have to put a quarter in to like play a game. I want you to know or pick up on what you're supposed to do and be independently active on what needs to happen. Like I look for people who can independently accomplish things and don't need to be like handheld through a lot of
self-starters,
Okay.
basically. Like
Yeah,
somebody's going to take a task and kind of run with it.
exactly. And I'm not looking for like entrepreneurs who need a job for a little bit. I'm just looking for someone who like, if the scope of work says X and then they talk to the client and it says X plus Y, they know to like talk to the project manager and say, hey, the scope is pushing. What are we going to do about this? As opposed to like just assuming that they should do X and Y because that's the conversation they had. I'm looking for people who think a little bit more independently,
or more negatively coming back to you and asking like, Randy, this changed from X and to X plus Y. What should I do?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So you guys aren't asking like, hey, what's your favorite Pantone color or anything like that?
Well, I mean, I would, but we're running Pantone is actually a pretty hot topic in the Adobe circles right now because Pantone wanted to up what they charged Adobe, and Adobe said no, thank you. And so Adobe is cutting out Pantone colors from the Creative Suite.
Wow.
And you need a subscription to Pantone for $20 a month to get Pantone colors in the Creative Suite here soon.
Wow.
And now that's all one thing, but here's what's happening if you've defined Pantone colors in the Creative Suite, they're all going to turn to black once Adobe's deal with Pantone goes away.
That is mind-blowing.
Degrading gracefully.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not going to ask favorite Pantone colors, but I do evaluate portfolios. Like one of the nice things about the work that we do is you can actually demonstrate the work that you do.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's like UX or visual design or content marketing or content strategy. Like these are all things that you can say, hey, I did this thing. Here's the thinking behind this thing. And I can get a sense of the quality of their work. That's another factor that goes into it in addition to the questions.
Yeah, I'm always curious about more visually creative interviews because like I mean I'm a freelancer, so I don't go through a lot of traditional interviews, but I have, and a lot of times they'll be like, here's the coding challenge, build this thing, and I'm just imagining creatives are like, okay, you need to make a logo. You have 30 minutes, make a logo. Here's the Photoshop, here's the laptop. And I just imagine like that in general, that type of interviewing, I think is thankfully finally falling away in some spheres, but I can't imagine that would be very helpful. Other
should
than
be falling away in all spheres. Doing work for free is awful.
Even if you're paid to do that, there's a lot of like those tests. First, I will say unequivocally, those tests are bullshit. There's no context. There's no like all you're getting out of that is like if you say, hey, designer, make me a landing page in 6 hours. Let's see what you can do. Like all you're getting is 6 hours what it's gonna take for them to do that design work. Maybe there's someone who like it takes them 3 days to come up with perfect work, but they need that time to process it. And like, you're just going to get a pretty page. You're not going to get a page that has all of the constraints that are needed
Yeah.
on a project. And if you provide them with all of those constraints on a project, you're really hiring them to do a freelance project. And like,
Yeah.
no, it's
And,
terrible all around.
and you don't get to see how they collaborate. I mean, there's a whole lot more
Mhm.
there too. So and just one more comment on Pantone before we move on. Just because I've only used Pantone colors once in my life, and that's actually, if you see the blue on the wall here, if you're watching the video,
A little bit.
that's
Yeah.
the Pantone color from my logo. And the only way to get that was to go to some paint shop and order that. But that's the only time I've ever used it, and I'm worried in a couple of months it's going to turn black.
It probably
That's-
is. It probably
I'm
is.
gonna have to subscribe $20 a month to keep my wall blue.
Yes. Absolutely.
So one thing that I'm curious about is kind of going back to an earlier question that I kind of had is, do you have developers directly on your team that you hire as well?
Sadly, no. I've been one of the things that I've been doing as a creative director is bringing together front end engineers and designers and bringing that workflow tighter, because I believe that like, by making a tighter workflow, it provides better work. So for instance, like a classic is like, do the design work, throw it over, the wall to the front end engineer with like maybe a meeting, and then the front end engineer, will occasionally ask questions from the designer. And that's two people using two different like technologies and languages to do things. And that's not successful. What I've been doing is trying to bring front end engineering in as early as possible so that we can start bringing that along. So for instance, like we have okay, I hate working on visual design in sprints, but I'm going to use sprints as an example. Like, so the first sprint, the designer's going to like design the event page. Okay. And then in the second sprint, the front end engineer is going to build out the event page. And in that second sprint, the designer is working on the news page. All right. So what that means is that both of them are on the project full time and they can collaborate. So the front end engineer can like every day post a new link saying, hey, how does this look? And the designer can weigh in because they're still in the mindset of the project. And so the front end engineer is always a sprint behind the design, and we move forward in a way that allows both of them to collaborate and do what they need to do. And we've had a great deal of success with that. I have made snarky remarks in meetings that I would be happy to have the front end engineering team on my team. But I'm sure our director of technology wouldn't care for that. So
I also think that Storybook really helps with that too, because you can, as a front end engineer, you can give a lot of controls to the design. Like if they're not quite sure on color palette on a particular component, for example, rather than, you can just give that access in the controls in Storybook and collaborate together on page.
Yeah.
But
you can stress test things too in Storybook, because then you can see like what happens if you like put in the word like anti-disestablishmentarianism into the button, like how is it going to wrap and what's going to happen, and so you can plan for that button.
One of the things that I'm curious about too, with the question they asked about having a developer on the team, wasn't so much having the whole front end development team under your purview, for example. I mean, more specifically, like I'm wondering if it's useful in some of these situations to have a developer on your team for two reasons. One, call out like, hey, the direction you're going in here is probably going to be problematic. So not even like them just prototyping stuff, but also like building tooling to make it easier for your more visual creative side to like explore things. Like I think sometimes when things are siloed, there's not cross-pollination in tooling, right? And so if you have when you have somebody from a different discipline on a team and they see that whole workflow, I think there can be some inspiration sometimes in how people think about and solve problems. But I think it's also a hard sell sometimes to be like, hey, you should have a visual designer trying to do some of this front end design, or you should have a front end designer trying to do some of the design. Because just seeing the problem from that perspective can really be like, oh, this is why we keep getting designs this way, because there's a button in Photoshop, you click this button and it outputs that design, and it's just really easy. And then and maybe that becomes like, well, that design is really hard to implement as a front end designer, so maybe we build a plugin for Photoshop or whatever you use that outputs something similar that's easier to do in the front end, but still makes their workflow easy for generating whatever they're generating.
Yeah. So along those lines, all of our projects have a technical strategist and a tech lead that are involved in the project. So while they're not on the creative team, they're part of our creative process. So they're on typically a few hours a week, sometimes a little bit more depending on what they're doing, to give us that feedback, to make sure that the crazy stuff that we come up with is crazy stuff that we can build or crazy stuff that we can't build. And so that's built into our project process.
As a solution architect, my favorite thing is to crush the hopes and dreams of design teams, to say, like, guys, this is out of control. Like, there are so many possibilities and permutations here. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah. See, one of the things that I try to encourage my team to do is to check out places like CodePen, where people post like cool, crazy front end stuff that people do, so that they can understand like what the front end can do that their design tools like Figma or Adobe XD can't do. And as a result, like if I go to a front end engineer and they're like, oh, well, we totally can't do this thing. And then I pull up a CodePen and I say, this guy did it, or this girl did it. And I'm just like, why don't you just steal this code? And so I'm just like, I have proven that it is possible. Let's talk about why it's not possible for this project, or maybe that'll change an opinion on this.
And to be clear, as a solutions architect, I like to work with the design team to ensure that we are creating something that is manageable, not
John, we are mortal enemies.
I don't agree with that at all.
I just, before we move on, I just want to say I went down a rabbit hole in CodePen the other day on finding CSS only carousels.
And now you want to bring that rabbit hole to the Talking Drupal podcast. Okay. Go.
Absolutely. It's one of the most fascinating things I found, like the way that people get like generally what you would expect from a JavaScript carousel to work with CSS only. It's just fascinating to me. I thought, like, I was just like, I wonder if you can do that. And then I found like all the different, like there's 20, 30, 40 different solutions for doing that. None of them really great and something that you would actually want to implement on a site, I think. But to your point, Randy, it's one of those things where it really pushes boundaries and lets you see like, this is what's possible with what's the latest in CSS or JavaScript or whatever you're looking at. And maybe you can convert that into something that's useful for a project.
Okay. Another aside lightning question to the creative director. Carousels on websites. Great. I love them. No, I would prefer they go off into the ether and never be seen again, or maybe something else.
Well, I was being nice and I wasn't going to bring up my opinion on carousels, but they can die in a fire.
Yes.
The reason that they can die in a fire is that they the only problem that carousels solve is an issue of like internal like discussions and problems. Like you've got a lot of content that you want to feature. You don't want anything to feel second string. And so if you put it in the carousel, everything gets a big picture. And in theory, that's great. But in practice, your users, the people who are coming to the site, only see like one of the carousels and interact with one of the carousels. Notre Dame, pick your poison, did a study into carousels that proved that like only like 2% of people interacted with the second carousel. And then an even steeper drop off for a third carousel. And so as a result, like carousels for featuring content is a bad idea. Now, there are like places where carousel like behavior can work. One example of that is like the Netflix app. Netflix like shows you a bunch of TV shows in a carousel that you navigate through. And so for things like that, a carousel is good because you're looking through options. That's a good use of a carousel. But a carousel as like a hero, I'm very sorry, but it can die in a fire.
That's interesting because I always thought that like carousels were invented to appease the various units of a company that needed space on a homepage, right? Like the marketing team's like, all of these really important people need space on our homepage. Okay, well, let's put it in a carousel. Your stuff's on the homepage now, except nobody can ever see it.
And the reality is that some companies, that's a good solution. Like it's not a good solution for the users, but it's a good solution for the internal struggle that the company has. And like I know that whenever I have clients who ask for carousels, I tell them no. And then we talk about why they need a carousel. And sometimes I yield because I don't want to cause problems for my clients because of something that's a bad idea for their users. But I also want to make sure that we're putting it there. When we put it there, we understand why we're doing it.
Yeah, I think we could probably have a whole show on overcoming organizational politics and internal issues. But let's not go down that rabbit hole. Instead, let's talk about makeup. And what I mean by that is the makeup of a creative team. So how was that segue? Yeah.
That was good. That was good.
Anyway, I'm curious as the creative director, right? You are the figurehead of this team. And I'm curious what you think a optimal makeup is of a creative team.
Sure. So originally when I talked about what a creative director does, it varied by like what kind of industry it is. And so what I'm going to talk about for the makeup of the creative team is for creating content rich website experiences. And for me, the way that I have my team right now, we have a UX strategist who just does deep dives into UX strategy only. And I have 3 UX/UI designers, so user experience / user interface designers. And I also have a content strategist. And on this team right now, the reason that I have 3 UX/UI people is that I wanted people who could do basic user experience work, basic to medium. Okay. My team is really good at UX work. And I wanted to make sure that I had people who could do visual design, because we have a lot of like requests for visual design, but I need to spread that out. I can't just have one visual designer because then it would be a bottleneck. And so I've hired these 3 roles that are explicitly kind of like crossing boundaries, to be able to move them around and keep them busy as an agency works. So on a typical creative team, if you have people that are dedicated, a small team like ours that's dedicated to like visual design, UX, it's hard to keep everybody busy at the same time. And we had that problem at 4 Kitchens a long time ago, where like we have what we kind of call the restaurant problem, where like at lunch and dinner, the tables are all full, but at like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you've got a mostly empty restaurant. And so we would have gaps in people's work. And so by hiring people who have diverse skill sets, I'm able to have coverage on all of the work that I need. So I added a UX strategist to my team, a dedicated UX strategist to do specific deep dive work. In fact, he used to be a librarian, so I know he's good. Because librarians are very smart people and they're also very, very fun people. And he does the deep research that we need to have done on things. Not that my UX UI designers can't do deep research. It's just that whenever we have like a project, like there's a university in Texas that we've been doing like a lot of deep research for over the years. And he gets assigned that project because that's like user interviews, writing reports. It never turned like, that doesn't turn into like visual design in a project. It's just refining the user experience of some key things. So I hired him so that I could specifically have someone who had deep talents. And then I hired a content strategist because every website needs content. And I firmly believe that content is the reason that people come to websites. And I want us to make sure that we are helping our clients in the best way possible. Like, I don't just want it to be like we create a design system and we can create a component library and then they pour like really bad content into it and then they don't get the results that they need. And so I have a content strategist. Again, my UXers can do content strategy, but I wanted someone who was dedicated to it so that we could focus on that. And so, in my opinion, like, this is the best team makeup right now. My eye towards the future in like the next couple of years, I want to get a second content strategist because I really want to focus on that work, and our clients are responding very well to that. And I want to hire a visual designer, just like an explicit like visual designer to focus on some of the like crazier aspects of design. Like, our UI designers right now are very, very good at their job and they understand like the web and they design towards that. I kind of want to hire a visual designer who has no idea anything about the web and so creates crazy, gorgeous stuff that we then have to like kind of backpedal a little bit and start producing like real like crazy things.
Yeah, I mean, pushing limits is good. I mean, that's one of our early questions was how do you keep up to speed? And one of the ways to do that is push your limits and find out. So you need to find out what the new technology is. I was talking to a colleague the other day about that. Like, sometimes you, at least as a developer, you get used to a solution. Once you have a solved problem, you solve it that way. And sometimes when you're looking to solve another problem, you realize, oh, this thing that I've had solved for 10 years, there's now an easier way to solve that if I had looked for it 5 years ago, would have found. And it's not the end of the world because it's a solved problem, but it's like, hey, if you can save, for example, this happens in CSS all the time. Like, when Flex came out, it made a lot of float stuff not necessary anymore. And Grid is, making a lot of things way easier, right? So if you're pushing boundaries on the design side, then it's definitely going to be it's definitely something that can help you keep up to speed too. So one of your responsibilities at Four Kitchens is to kind of craft and guide the team, as we've been talking about. And there's been some pretty significant challenges to managing teams over the last couple of years with the pandemic. I'm curious how you approach that, and what kind of Four Kitchens is doing around managing that for their team.
Sure. So, I'll start with Four Kitchens and then I'll talk about the creative team. So Four Kitchens weathered the pandemic very well. I mean, not perfectly, but it was much better than we thought it was going to be. And a lot of that is because we put a lot of like thoughtful planning into like what we want to ensure that we're stable. And so we like sock, money away for a rainy day. And the pandemic was a long, long rainy day. And so Four Kitchens was able to weather it with a like minimal amount of like what would be considered like negative action from the leadership team. I think that like we had to let go of a couple of people, but it was fairly minimal. And for the creative team, it was a sea change. Prior to the pandemic, I was not in a leadership position at Four Kitchens, and during the pandemic, the team that was there, it was called the Design and UX team, or UX and Design team. Those individuals, like a lot of people during the pandemic, decided to like look for greener pastures, and ended up leaving for other jobs. And those people are all dear friends of mine. I stay in touch with them. But they decided that they were going to go to like larger, more stable companies during the pandemic, that they figured would weather it better, because there was a lot of uncertainty during the pandemic, especially in the early days. Looking back, we sometimes think like, oh, it wasn't too bad. No, it was really nerve wracking. I think everybody had like one foot out of the door. All right. So when those individuals left for kitchens during the pandemic, this was an opportunity to reinvent what the creative team would be at Four Kitchens. And so I was promoted, and I was told, hey, what do you want this team to be? What do you want it to look like? How do you want it to be formatted? And so that's when I made the change from calling it the UX and design team to the creative team. I began hiring for the positions that I talked at length about earlier, and began like executing my vision and hiring for the types of people and the skills that I wanted. And so honestly, I think that it was a blessing, because I think that the creative work that Four Kitchens has been doing in the last couple of years has been really stellar and top notch. I know that seems a lot like I'm kind of patting myself on the back, but the reality is that my team has done some really great work, and I'm not shy to talk about the great work that they've done.
That's awesome. I think it's interesting to see that perspective and to see that change. And you know, shifting as we kind of come to a close here on this conversation, I'm wondering, as a creative director, what inspires you? What kind of motivates you?
My Honestly, my motivation as a creative director is to improve the world. I want to make the world a better place. I want to make the way that people interact with the world easier, and more like friendly and delightful. And when I say interact with the world, like the technology that we use, like our phones, our laptops, our tablets, these are other ways that we are engaging with the world. And so I want to make sure that the work that I'm doing and the work that my team is doing is something I call like nutritious work, like work that feeds the soul. I want to make sure that whenever like we have a project that launches, that project that's launching is in some small or large way improving the world. I want to make sure that the contributions that we make to open source and other communities are improving the lives of others. I want to try and make people feel good about themselves. I want them to understand that like if a website is broken or technology doesn't work, that the technology or the website is bad, not you. And so like these are things that inspire me as a creative director.
So I've got the same question, but as a manager, what inspires you? Where do you look when you're trying to figure out how to manage the team?
I view management as building a community. Like the reality is that like my team is a community. And I want to make sure that everybody in my community is contributing. I want to make sure that they feel respected. I want to make sure that they are appropriately challenged in ways that invigorate them. And I want to make sure that they are growing as well. Like earlier, I had mentioned like how like, you hire someone, you mentor someone and go through it. And then at some point they leave. Part of what I do with my community, with my team, during like one of our very first meetings, I tell them someday you will leave Four Kitchens. And when you are ready to leave Four Kitchens, I said, talk to me. I will help you leave Four Kitchens for whatever you need, because I know from personal experience that sometimes a company goes left and you want to go right. And no one has ever taken me up on that in the like 20 years I've been a manager. That's fine. I understand that like that's kind of a scary thing. I don't hold any ill will towards anyone. But I want to make sure that people are happy and vibrant where they are. And if they aren't, I want to get them to where they are.
I will tell you, Randy, from personal experience, I think that you are probably a great manager, because the managers that I've had in the past that have shared that philosophy or helped me with those changes have been great managers. I used to have a manager, and this was years ago, that it would basically say like, listen, the company is a brand, and then you are your own brand. So like you have to build your own brand as much as you're building the company brand, right? So like
Absolutely.
same sort of thing. Like one day we may go our separate ways, and that's fine. But like my goal as a manager is to make sure I'm building your personal brand, and in conjunction with that, helping the company brand to grow. So, I think that's great. And yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. So the big final question is 4Kitchens hiring?
4Kitchens is always hiring. We're always looking at people. And I know that sounds like a bullshit answer, and it kind of is. But the reality, okay, so the reality is that 4Kitchens, we have job posting all the time for a bunch of different roles. Right now, my team is not hiring. However, I want to make anyone who's listening to this aware, like if you want to have a conversation with me about like future prospects, I'm always open to chatting with people who want to move into a different position or want to carry on a conversation. In fact, that's how we ended up with the content strategist that we ended up with. My UX strategist said, "Hey, I've got a friend who wants to like leave where she is, wants to do content strategy. You've been talking about wanting to do content strategy. Do you want to have a conversation with her?" And I said, "Absolutely." And I had a conversation with her, and it was great. And then months later, when the position opened up, she was still looking. She came in, she interviewed. We had that conversation previously, and she ended up getting hired. I can't guarantee that everyone who has a private conversation with me is going to get hired. That's not how it works. But I'm open to talking to people because we're a small community. Like, and honestly, like there's a lot of crosstalk. I'm always happy to carry on a conversation with someone.
You can't hire somebody if you're not aware of them, right? And the first way of being aware is having that conversation.
Exactly. Like, it's like, hey, we had a conversation like 9 months ago that you were, a little bit unhappy, or I said something that you really appreciated. When I get a job opportunity open up, I will send you an email or a LinkedIn message or a Facebook chat or whatever, and say, hey, this is open. If you'd like to apply, rock on.
Well, Randy, thank you for joining us for these last 4 weeks. It's been a blast having you on the show.
I've enjoyed it. It has been the highlight of my week.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and our other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button. And Randy, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Probably Twitter. As long as it hasn't broken yet. My handle on Twitter is AmazingRando, all one word. You can also get a hold of me through AmazingRando.com, and honestly, just about every social network as Amazing Rando, including Drupal.org.
And John, how about you?
You can find me on all the social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi, and you can find out about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And I'm at Nixvan, NICXVAN, pretty much everywhere. I did create a Mastodon account, but I haven't quite figured out how it works. So, and I might be migrating servers. So, good luck finding me there.
Well, if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
Thanks, everyone.